It's your friendly neighbourhood academic, and class starts now. Let's begin with some current events. The US is in the final throes of its presidential race, and it's no pretty picture. Here we have a nation weakened and exhausted by war, economic strife, racial tensions, and ugly hyper-partisan politics. Sound familiar? What? I hear you say? This isn't Star Wars. This is more political stuff clogging up my feed. To you I say, be patient, young Padawan. We'll get to the clickbait soon, just a little more context. This is made all the worse by the presence of the orange strutting cancer that is Donald Trump. Born of privilege, ignorance, and profound arrogance, many have labelled him a misogynist, a bigot, an idiot, and a threat to the future of American democracy. I myself have called Trump a fascist with a capital F, and I'm not alone. Today's lesson, though, won't be about unpacking this accusation as it relates to Trump specifically, at least not yet, but what the term fascism actually means. Because, let's face it, it's a term that is so overused that its original meaning and power has faded away completely. So get ready, because it's time for some heavy philosophy, history, and economic theory all rolled in together. I think we might need some help from our friends from a galaxy far, far away. To those of you who are saying, but Star Wars is a bunch of movies for kids, they can't talk about fascism, don't be stupid. I say, congratulations on not figuring out how teaching through analogy works. But seriously, if you consider how two factions within the Star Wars universe function, then we get a great understanding of what fascism is, and hopefully we can understand the phenomenon which is Mr. Trump. The factions to which I refer are of course the Galactic Empire and the First Order. I'm an Ridge-Tridge kind of guy, but then who isn't? So let's forget the whole prequels thing. Like, not just for the sake of the discussion, but, just generally. Anyway, both are monolithic expansionist military powers intent on wiping out democracy and replacing them with dictatorship. So they're fascist then, right? Why is there still so much left of the video? Because, dear viewer, only one of the two, the First Order, meets the fascist minimum. The fascist minimum is a term coined by British political theorist Roger Griffin to describe the minimum ideological requirement that must be met in order for a group to be called properly fascist, in an academic sense, not just a my teacher told me to comb my hair for photo day at school, so therefore is a fascist sense. I'm not kidding, a friend of mine actually said this to me once. The fascist minimum refers specifically to an idea called palingenetic ultranationalism. A bit of a mouthful, but it refers to the idea that the nation, in this case the Star Wars galaxy, must be brought back to a past golden era through revolutionary violence. Based just on what we see in the movies and what is now considered canon in the extended universe, the First Order fits the bill. They want to return the galaxy to a past golden era through the destruction of the New Republic and the restoration of a new galactic empire. A bit like Mussolini and his plans to make Italy into a second Roman Empire. According to Kylo Ren in the novelization of The Force Awakens, it is the task of the First Order to remove the disorder from our own existence, so that civilization may be returned to stability that promotes progress. A stability that existed under the Empire, was reduced to anarchy by the rebellion, was inherited in turn by the so-called Republic, and will be restored by us. Future historians will look upon this as the time when a strong hand brought the rule of law back to civilization. We see these sentiments echoed in statements by Mussolini throughout his time in power, although most succinctly in the 1932 document, Doctrine of Fascism. The fascist state is a will to power and to government. In it, the tradition of Rome is an idea that has force. In the Doctrine of Fascism, empire is not only a territorial, military, or mercantile expression, but spiritual and moral. One can think of an empire, that is to say, a nation that directly or indirectly leads other nations, without needing to conquer a single square kilometre of territory. For fascism, the tendency to empire, that is to say, to the expansion of nations, is a manifestation of vitality. Its opposite, staying at home, is a sign of decadence. Peoples who rise or re-rise are imperialist. People who die are renunciatory. Fascism is the doctrine that is most fitted to represent the aims, the states of mind of a people, like the Italian people, rising again after many centuries of abandonment to slavery to foreigners. But what about the original caffeine-free vanilla empire of the original films? Are they not fascist? Well, dear viewer, strictly speaking, in the ideological sense, no they're not. What it is classically authoritarian, a dictatorship of one man, much like Spain under Franco. From my research on Wikipedia, the frankly wonderful receptacle of all things Star Wars, and what we see in the films, the rule of the Galactic Empire is the rule of one man, Emperor Palpatine. This rule is enforced through a massive police state and powerful armed forces, this is true, but no real systemic and structural changes occurred under the Empire. The galaxy maintains its original economic structures largely intact, certain prizes being given to the Emperor's most loyal lieutenants to placate any grumbling in the ranks of his enforcers, but more on that later. The average Imperial citizen lost their liberty, true, but other than that, their lives remained largely untouched. This is not the case under fascism, at least in its most theoretical sense. Fascism proposes a totalitarian system in which the state directs every conceivable aspect of the lives of its citizens, an inherently revolutionary concept. Remember Kylo Ren's manifesto. Future historians will look upon this as the time when a strong hand brought the rule of law back to civilization, with all the totality that implies. In another expanded universe novel, it is implied that the First Order recruits are fed a self-serving revisionist history which idealizes the strength and order that the Galactic Empire represented. Here we see the First Order explicitly and implicitly stating the fascist minimum as its raison d'etre. Nowhere in the films is this ideology implied to be the backbone of the Empire's authority. Indeed, much of the prequels is given over to the general sense of order that the transition to Empire is supposed to represent. Nowhere does Palpatine appeal to a glorious past, and in the fourth film, Grand Moff Tarkin makes a remark about the Senate that seems to imply a general contempt for the past.
Will continue to gain a support in the Imperial Senate.
The Imperial Senate will no longer be of any concern to us. I have just received word that the Emperor has dissolved the Council permanently. The last remnants of the old Republic have been swept away.
This is in stark contrast to Mussolini's Italy and the First Order, wherein a hybrid form of reverence for the past and sleek, militarized modernism informed by this reverence is the philosophical basis of the group's existence. Think too of how the First Order organizes itself. In pursuing its fascist ends, it does not have to maintain the physical and political infrastructure of the Empire as its predecessor did, but instead gives all of its energies to creating a militarized, highly regimented society, all striving towards the destruction of the New Republic. The whole society is in the armed forces. How could it not be totalitarian? In fact, that kind of society was the philosophical wet dream of Filippo Marinetti and the Futurists. They were an artistic movement that supported fascism and adored youth, speed, technology, and the need for newness and reinvigorating violence and destruction. If that ain't Kylo Ren and his friends in black, then what is? Okay, so the First Order meets the fascist minimum and could safely be called totalitarian. What next? Well, dear viewer, fascism was never really an explicit economic theory like Marxism is, but it did have certain ideas on the subject that it tried to implement. I told you we'd get back to it. Remember how I mentioned Palpatine prevented a coup against him by carving up choice slices of the galactic economy and giving it to his most loyal lieutenants? See, that kind of model works when you want to shore up your position as a classical dictator, rather than bring about a revolutionary change in society. Now, in practice, under Mussolini this was the case too, but theoretically speaking, fascism, in which the nation-state is the highest form of being, and nothing exists outside the state, seeks to mend the class divisions that have always weakened nations through three main economic policies: syndicalism, corporatism, and productivism. Syndicalism was the notion that capitalism could be replaced by confederations, or syndicates, of workers' unions, learned experts, and professionals. These syndicates would then advise the state on how to direct the economy. This then morphed into the practice of corporatism, where the larger syndicates became part of the national government, while private syndicates, or corporations, controlled smaller-scale industry. The aim of this policy was to serve the goals of productivism. This idea simply meant the harnessing and maximizing of industrial and agricultural power to serve the national interest. This idea, along with a lot of fascist ideology, was summed up by the phrase tutto nello Stato, niente a di fiore dello Stato, nulla contro lo Stato. Everything for the state, nothing outside the state, nothing against the state. The economic self-interest of the individual, while still seen as valid, was to take a back seat to the desires and goals of the state. And what was the ultimate purpose of this form of state-controlled capitalism? Well, war, of course. So, from what little we see and know of the First Order's economic activities, we can assume, given the highly regimented, militarized nature of their society, that each segment of the military could function as a sort of syndicate, working to achieve their national, or in this case galactic, self-interest. Indeed, Mussolini himself, in the Doctrine of Fascism, declared that such military thinking underlay fascist economic and social policy. The state is not simply a mechanism which limits the sphere of the supposed liberties of the individual. Neither has the fascist conception of authority anything in common with that of a police-ridden state. Far from crushing the individual, the fascist state multiplies his energies, just as in a regiment a soldier is not diminished, but multiplied by the number of his fellow soldiers. The only economic activity that the First Order seems to engage in outside its borders is the manufacture and acquisition of new weapons. From this we can assume that the Order is largely economically self-sufficient, a condition called autarky, the ultimate heady goal of any fascist regime. And what is this economic self-sufficiency all supposed to achieve? Well, the destruction of the New Republic and the expansion of the glorious fascist revolution throughout the Star Wars universe, of course. So where is Hitler in this whole discussion, you ask? He's popped up at the video a few times. Is Supreme Leader Snoke Hitler then? No, he's not. In this analogy he would be Il Duce Snoke, not Der Führer. But why is this? Because, dear viewer, Nazism and Fascism are actually two distinct ideologies, although they are very closely linked. While for fascists, the highest form of power and most important organ of life is the nation or state, for Nazis it is the race, which may or may not be coterminous with said nation. So at least theoretically speaking, fascism is a non-racist ideology. In practice, Mussolini was a white supremacist in the sense that he thought colonized people should be civilized by the white man, and all the violence that entails, but not actually systematically exterminated wholesale, as Adolf and the Nazis did. So here again we see theoretical fascism put into practice by the First Order, where they boast a very ethnically diverse makeup. This is also to say nothing of the difference in opinion on economics between the two ideologies, but we won't talk about that today. So here we are. I've avoided it long enough. We talked about Star Wars, and we talked about Mussolini. Things that we can all agree are either unequivocally good or unequivocally bad. Now I have to show my hand. It's late, but I have to show my hand. I think Donald Trump is unquestionably an evil man, and so should you. To suggest Hillary Clinton is just as bad is to ignore the evidence. Donald Trump is a fascist with a capital F. His Make America Great Again rhetoric, his advocating either the murder or imprisonment of his opponents, and his frankly disgusting policy towards Muslims and immigrants, all meet the fascist minimum of palingenetic ultranationalism. His protectionist economic policies, which inherently require huge government intervention in the economy, by the way, mirror that of Mussolini's Italy, and his insistence that citizens always give their interests over to the interests of their nation, a textbook productivism. Granted, this alone doesn't make him a fascist, and things like the Trans-Pacific Partnership are terrible, but look at the writing on the wall. He has called for the United States to openly commit war crimes as a matter of military routine and state policy.
Thing. They're using them as shields, but we're fighting a very politically correct war.
Yeah. Well, we see that happening in
the other thing is with the terrorists, you have to take out their families. When you get these terrorists, you have to take out their families. They care about their lives. Don't kid yourself. But they say they don't care about their lives. You have to take out their families.
He has actively stoked hatred between groups of Americans, not coming out against the Ku Klux Klan when they endorsed him. He dismisses and denigrates movements like Black Lives Matter, arguing that people who disagree with him, who then come to his rallies, would have, in the good old days, been attacked and beaten by his supporters, and says it as if it were a good thing. His disdain for democracy is obvious. Donald Trump is a fascist, intent on dismantling liberal democracy in one of the most powerful nations in the world. The nation that produced Abraham Lincoln and Martin Luther King has now produced its own strutting, preening, and insecure Mussolini. But this time, he would have nuclear weapons. And that is terrifying. And Clinton used the wrong email? Who cares? I implore my American friends, as fellow human beings and citizens of the world, please do not elect this man your president on this last day. Democracy is just too important to let slip away. I'll let Franklin Delano Roosevelt close things out with his message from so long ago. So goodbye, good luck, like, share and subscribe, and remember, you don't need a degree, just watch me.
Democracy has disappeared in several other great nations, not because the people of those nations disliked democracy, but because they had grown tired of unemployment and insecurity, of government confusion, government weakness. Finally, in desperation, they chose to sacrifice liberty in the hope of getting something to eat. We in America know that our own democratic institutions can be preserved and made to work. But in order to preserve them, we need to act together, to meet the problems of the nation boldly, and to prove that the practical operation of democratic government is equal to the task of protecting the security of the people. History proves that dictatorships do not grow out of strong and successful governments, but out of weak and helpless ones. We are a rich nation. We can afford to pay for security and prosperity without having to sacrifice our liberties into the bargain.